So Black Phone 2 couldn't have came at a better time around Halloween. I just finished watching it. We have returning director Scott Derrickson in his chilling tale with The Grabber starring Ethan Hawke. Mason Thames returns as Finney, the young boy who was kidnapped by the Grabber in Black Phone 1. And as you remember, he would get a bunch of phone calls by a bunch of kids who was victims to the Grabber, and they would basically warn him about his situation. This time, Finney is joined by his sister Gwen, who was played by Madeline McGraw. And I think this movie did a really great job of being a sequel to part 1. You know, it actually continues from part 1 and it carries on from where it left off. You know, Finney is now a young teenage boy who's plagued with the haunting memories of going through everything he'd been through from Black Phone 1 when he was kidnapped by the Grabber. I think it's crazy how much time has actually passed since Black Phone 1. The first installment came out in 2021, and now it's been roughly 4 years since we've had the second installment, and Finney's hit a growth spurt. You know, he's a young teenage boy now, and he's trying to cope with, you know, being one of the Grabber's victims. He's still haunted by memories of being a victim trapped in that basement, receiving those daunting, haunting phone calls from these kids from the other side. So now he's smoking marijuana, he's stressed, he's getting into fights, he's trying to find ways to deal with the fear and, you know, deal with everything that he's been through. I think Black Phone 2 did a lot of things different than Black Phone 1. I think the fear was also a little bit different because in Black Phone 1, we had the Grabber playing this, you know, serial killer lunatic who would kidnap these kids and he would torment them in this basement and he would, you know, murder people. In this one, you know, the Grabber has passed on. He died in part 1 and he comes back in part 2 as this haunting spirit that's still doing the same thing he was doing in part 1, only this time it's different. They kind of added that Nightmare from Elm Street sort of effect where now if you fall asleep, he can hurt you in your dreams. I feel like this movie is what you would get if Stranger Things, Super 8, and The Nightmare from Elm Street had a baby. I feel like they try to add a little bit of all these little elements within this movie and create this, you know, big thing, the cinematic experience, because there's so many different details you could pick from all these different, you know, iconic shows or movies. This time things are different. Instead of going after Finney, the Grabber is going after his sister Gwen. He wants to exact his revenge on Finney in ways that he cannot even imagine. Even though this movie kind of pulls a lot from The Nightmare on Elm Street, I can't say if I could compare the two because there's differences in this. It's like in the Black Phone 2, the Grabber, he can hurt you in your dreams. You know, you fall asleep, then he can, you know, he can hurt you. He can do things to you that, you know, he can't do to you in real life because he's not living no more. But they actually changed this around within the third act of the movie because then it's kind of like instead of hurting you in your dreams, now he's able to hurt you while you're awake, which kind of changed the premises a little bit of how this compares to The Nightmare on Elm Street because in that, Freddy was only able to hurt you in your dreams. But it's still sort of the same concept because the more afraid you are of him is the more powerful he becomes. But I think it's still great how they did it. You could still see the similarities, but you can also see the differences. I love the way this movie was shot. You know, I think it was done differently from what I'm normally used to because when Finney and Gwen are awake, everything looks real clear. You know, the camera quality is real high quality. You know, it's real HD-ish. But then when they fall asleep and the Grabber's invading their dreams, everything looks real grainy. It looks real like old school kind of camera work. You know, it looks like it was shot by a Panasonic video recording camera from the 90s that you found at Radio Shack or something like that, you know. So it really shows that they really wanted you to differentiate the difference between when someone was awake or when someone was in their dreams. The director clearly wanted you to see the difference when someone was awake and when someone was asleep because when they're asleep, it looks like real old school bootleg VHS quality, you know what I'm saying? But then when they're awake, everything's fine and, you know, you can see things more clearly. Ethan Hawke, I don't feel like Ethan Hawke gets the kind of respect he deserves as the Grabber. I think the Grabber is a really great, you know, scary icon. I think he deserves more attention for, you know, things like Halloween. I don't really see a lot of people dressing up as the Grabber around Halloween, but I feel like after watching this movie, you might see a lot more people actually paying attention more to this character and giving him some more respect for that. I'm so glad we live in a world that if I want to hear my phone play SpongeBob SquarePants for a ringtone, I can actually hear that now instead of actually listening to the old ringers from those payphones from back in the day. I feel like this team went and found like some of the oldest, most destroyed payphones that still exist in the world and used it for this movie. These phones are destroyed. These phones are old. You could see the quality of these phones are torn down, and it makes for a really horrifying experience. Now, if you know me, you know I love horror movies. And one thing I love about certain horror movies is when they're shot in the wintertime or when they're shot with snow, and this movie does that. You know, when you have snow effects in a horror movie, it just adds to that fear, because now you're in fear of your life from the person you're running from, this serial killer, this madman, but you're also in fear of your life because you have to survive the night, you have to survive this weather, and it's a blizzard where Finn and Gwen is at. So Finny and Gwen, they go back to this old Christian resort that their mom used to go to when she was younger, and they start to have these hallucinations, these visions, these dreams, and they're trying to put pieces together and solve these clues to why they're having these visions. Why is the grabber still coming after them? What connection does he have to their mother? I feel like Ethan Hawke is really good when it comes to the grabber, and I feel like the grabber as a character himself is a scary character. I mean, you don't want to see this kind of character when you turn all the lights off in your house. You don't want to run into something like that. You don't want to see him just pop in and pop out of nowhere. And in this movie, he does stuff like that. You know, he reappears and he disappears as he sees fit, because he's not a living person. He's now a spirit. I don't know if we want to call him a dream demon, because in this movie, he's hurting people while they're asleep and while they're awake. So you kind of just got to call him a demon. I feel like Madeline McGraw as Gwen really is the highlight of this whole movie. You know, she really is, you know, great in this movie. She acted her ass off. Like, really, you could feel how afraid she was, you know, because now she's wondering, like, why am I having these dreams? What's wrong with me? Why am I having these visions? I'm seeing crazy things with these kids being killed and murdered, and, you know, you can really see it in her face. She's terrified of what's happening to her. Mason does a great job as Finney as well, because now it's like, instead of just being afraid of the grabber, he's more afraid of what the grabber is going to do to his sister. So it's not really the fear of the grabber, you know, hurting him. He's not really afraid of that no more. He's grown now, so he's like, I beat you once, I could beat you again. But the problem is now he's after his sister in her dreams, so now Finney is afraid and fears for his sister's life. You know, because Black Phone 2 is not just about a murderer, it's not just about a serial killer, you know, it's also about the victims. You know, the victims are trying to warn, you know, other people about this guy and what he did to them. And then you got, you know, Ethan Hawke, who is the grabber, who's also psychologically kind of playing with the victims' minds, and he's playing with your head and kind of showing you things to make you more afraid of him before he actually takes you in his van and then does what he wants to do with you. And I think there's so many different avenues and things to pull from, because you're not just worried about the grabber, you know, it's also, you're worried about these ghosts from these victims that the grabber actually, you know, killed, you know, and they're trying to warn other people about what he did to them. And then on top of that, you got to deal with this blizzard that they're in, and it's probably the worst blizzard ever. And on top of that, you got these payphones that are ringing off the hook that shouldn't even be working anymore. This movie is being shot to make it seem like they're back in the 1970s. That's why you have these payphones still around. You know what I'm saying? Payphones that shouldn't even be working because they're out of service. You don't even have service for these phones, but they're ringing and they're calling off the hook. And when you answer the phone, it's some, you know, person from beyond the grave that shouldn't even exist no more calling you, telling you, hey, you know, I don't know how I died. I don't know why I'm here. I shouldn't be here. What's going on? But hey, did you see Black Phone 2? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Let me know in the comments. Please like and subscribe, as it'll help grow my channel. And remember, everybody, it isn't cinema if it ain't absolute cinema. Till next time, take care.